Okay, here's a little shot of the master cylinder reservoir. I just wanted to point out that little line you see in the casting inside the reservoir is the full mark. The brake fluid in there is kind of dark looking. It's a sign that it's deteriorating. And here's a shot of the lid goes on first. Under that is this little plastic piece. It has a little shoulder that kind of fits down into this bellows there that holds it in place to the edge of the reservoir, and then floating on the brake fluid will be this little baffle. Can't stress enough how critical it is that all this stuff be clean. I've washed my hands before touching it. If anything needs cleaned up, don't use any sort of solvent. The only thing you should clean these parts with is .4 brake fluid. Again, brake fluid eats paint, so we want to be careful not to get it anywhere. Powder coating seems to resist the stuff pretty well, as does the plastic bodywork on this thing. So that brings us back around to getting ready to evacuate the old brake fluid from the system here. A little bit on the bright side here for the camera. I'll go ahead and get that tube jammed onto my bleeder valve there and pump away a little vacuum. And one thing about these Mighty Vacs on a small vehicle like this, it has such a small brake fluid capacity that when we're sucking our new fluid through, we'll be a little gentle with how much vacuum we pump up and how far you open the bleeder valve. So you can suck the whole system dry unintentionally when you're not trying to. Of course, right now that's sucking the system dry is exactly what I'm trying to do. And you can see we pretty much got the fluid sucked out of it there. I'll go ahead and close that. Pump up a little more vacuum and tip the hose off, and that way we won't lose so much as a drop. And I'll go ahead and suck the brake fluid out of the other caliper here, and we'll go ahead and refill it. Okay, there's some pretty good recesses actually in that reservoir where once you've drawn all the brake fluid out, there's some low spots below where it picks up fluid into the master cylinder, so just kind of suck those out and put some fresh fluid in there. And basically I'm going to run just a few inches, 5-6 inches of vacuum, so as not to draw out more than I want, and I'll suck fluid through here until I get no bubbles. And periodically we'll just make sure that the master cylinder reservoir is staying full. And we'll go do the other side and then clean things up and put those caps back on. Fresh brake fluid. And if I get the level a little too high, I'll just suck some more fluid out of the bleeder until it's down to that mark, and we'll button that back up. Okay, the front brake is all buttoned up. Got a nice firm feel with the lever. That Mighty Vac is really handy. Didn't even come close to spilling a drop, and get all the air out the first time, every time. Really a tool I'd highly recommend. Anyway, let's have us a look-see at the rear brake system. These have a single rear drum, and there's a wear indicator on these. Essentially, you've got two adjusters. One is for the handbrake and one is for the foot brake. And then you've got a, well, you can see it right there, there's a little pointer here on the clamp on the end of the brake here, and there's a little casting with an arrow. If when you apply the brakes, those two arrows line up, it indicates that your brake shoes are shot, in which case you'd have to pull the tire in the drum and replace those shoes. Also on the back drum is a drain. The drum has a seal around the circumference, and if you start having the brakes go away when you've been in the water and pull that plug and you get muddy water out of it, then it's time to pull it apart and replace the seals. Anyway, this looks like it's in good shape. The other thing we want to check, want to have roughly half an inch or so of free play at the lever. I've got a little more than that, so I may run the wing nut there. I believe it's the upper one. We can find out real quick. Set the parking brake, and yeah, that would be the upper one. Now we can wind that in a little bit until we have a little less free play there. That looks good. And then basically same thing with the foot control. We want about half an inch of free play before the brakes engage, and it looks like foot pedal wise we're pretty close to that, so we'll leave that alone. The next thing we're going to be covering is the alignment, and as long as I have it up off the ground here, for illustration purposes, we'll take a look at the tie rods. Oops. I'm back. Cheap tripod. Anyhow, the tie rod ends on this are male, meaning the tie rod has threads that thread into the tie rod end, and the inner end of the tie rod is left-handed threads, and the right end, or the outside ends, are normal right-hand threads. Also under here, I mentioned earlier the nut on the end of the steering column, or the steering shaft there, and you can see that right there with the cotter pin, so that's something to look for if you have slop. While we've got it off the ground here, I'll take a look at the boots on the tie rod ends too and make sure they're in good condition. Anyway, when we get to talking about alignment, if you do have to adjust the alignment, it's very important that you don't force this joint past the end of its travel. So it's important we use 2 wrenches, one on the square end of the tie rod end and another one on the lock nut, as opposed to just grabbing the lock nut and forcing the tie rod over. Then also, if we do make an adjustment when we lock the tie rods, we want to make sure the tie rod can rotate. You don't want to lock the nuts where one tie rod is all the way on that end of its play and the other one's already is all the way over on that end of its play, and if you do that, the tie rod won't rotate like that, and it can bind up as the suspension moves through its travel. So anyway, we'll go ahead and get the front wheels back on, get the thing on the ground, and we'll show you how to measure the toe out on one of these. Okay, got the machine back on the ground. Got the before you set it on the ground, you want to snug the lug nuts up. These wheels are centered by the lug nuts, so you want to make sure they're fairly snug before you set it down on the ground, and then torque it to is it 64 Newton meters? I believe. Yeah, 64 Newton meters in a crisscross pattern. even though we haven't had the back wheels off the ground, we went ahead and checked those anyway, just as part of the running around and looking at fasteners part of service. Anyway, alignment wise, what we're looking for is two things: that the bar is pointed straight when the quad is going straight, with all the tires at proper pressure. Having one of them low will throw that off quite a bit. And also we want the toe out to be correct. Essentially, toe on these is measured at the tread of the tires, so that if you were to put a mark on the back of the tire and roll the machine forward, it would be wider at the front, being towed out. If it were towed in, it would be narrower at the front. And we can't measure that directly, of course, because the frame of the quad and front drive shaft and all that stuff is in the way. So basically we need something of a fixed width to use as a reference point. You could use one of those, you've seen the little rod with clamp down pointers that you use to make sure a frame is straight. You can use that, or something U-shaped basically that'll fit up under the frame. What I've found is pretty handy, and a lot of people use, is have two builder's squares here that the long ends are just C-clamped together, so that the so that the outsides of the short ends are about the widths of the center of the tires. And what we'll do is we'll slip that under the machine. Get them right up against the backs of the tires there, and here. Grab us a pin. It's a different pen. I'll make us a vertical line on the backs of tires on both sides. And we'll pull the squares out. Brakes released, and we'll roll the machine forward. Till the marks I made are now at the front of the tires. Then we'll measure the difference on the other tire. The spec we're looking for here is about 1 3/16 inches. So we'll grab a tape measure and take a look at it. I don't know if you can see that very well, but we're pretty much right spot on. And the heptagon machine does go straight when the bars are straight. If it didn't, we'd end up adjusting one or the other tie rod until it did. An easy way to get that close is to take I'll use like a dial caliper and set the overall width of the caliper, you know, with the tail sticking out, to the distance between the two lock nuts on one tie rod, and then compare that to the other side. if nothing is bent, and if there is something bent, we'd straighten it. Anyway, if nothing is bent, when the tie rods are the same length, we should be pretty close to steering straight with the bar straight. Might be a little off just because of variances in tolerance and stuff. Anyhow, we've got the proper toe out. If we had to adjust it in or out, and it runs straight with the bars straight, we'd adjust each tie rod the same amount. Say a quarter turn on each tie rod in or out to tow it in or out. And that way we'd maintain the relationship of having the bar straight when the quad is going straight. So anyway, that's how to check the alignment on one of these.